How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.
Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, June the 29th, and Andy Burnham will be the new Prime Minister 3 weeks from today. He's staying in the North a bit longer with a major speech mid-morning on the economy, welfare and devolution at a museum in Manchester. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Let's just start with actually the dates. Burnham becomes PM on Monday, July the 20th. Now, that's just a little bit later than the July 17th we were initially told. Now, when that 3-day delay emerged last week, we were told that it was because you can't hold a Labour special conference and change the Prime Minister on the same day. Guess what, Anne? That's not actually true, or it's not at least the full picture. I'm told that it's because when the original plan was drawn up with the timetable, they didn't properly check with Buckingham Palace, and actually the King simply isn't available on that Friday to change Prime Minister.
Always good to check if the King is available, if your plans depend on it. And hang on, the King's got something else on while the number 10 guard is changing. Explain.
I believe he's still going to be north of the border in Balmoral that day. And I can understand this. There doesn't seem to be a desire to repeat the sort of plane ride to Scotland that you saw when Boris Johnson stood down and Liz Truss stood up with all of the echoes that could bring. So that's the real excuse, I'm told, why dates changed because of the King. And Whitehall does as Whitehall does and came up with an excuse to make you look the other way. But I love how the British state works.
We'll get a foretaste of the Burnham premiership this morning. In that speech was going to be in London, but got moved to Manchester because the key theme is indeed devolution. The irony would have been a bit too apparent. He will pledge to deliver good growth in every postcode by overseeing a significant transfer of power out of Whitehall to local communities. We get the first outline then of economic policy this morning, but not the identity of his incoming Chancellor. So we'll all just have to keep placing our bets on that one.
So what might this look like in practice? According to The Guardian this morning, the former Greater Manchester mayor is understood to be considering handing local authorities some powers over taxes, including business rates. In the words of Andy Burnham's team, the central proposal is, quote, the biggest transfer of power out of Whitehall in modern times, with decision-making pushed to the regions and local communities.
Burnham will also pledge that he'll give mayors and councils responsibility for welfare reform and help get a lost generation of nearly 1 million young people back into work, education or training. The team saying the speech is the start of a significant response to a pretty searing report on NEETs, those not in employment or education or training, by Alan Milburn. Another Blairite link being made after the James Purnell appointment there.
Right, so the Burnham team sent out a trail for the speech overnight. It's interesting on a number of levels. It absolutely doesn't stint on the rhetoric. Andy Burnham is coming in big. I mean, all that, talk of giving Britain the circuit breaker it needs, changing politics to make it work for us, and he's on a 10-year mission, right? So he's coming in wanting us to feel like there's a big bang at the start of his premiership. But I suppose, Anne, on another level, I read the trail and did think that quite a lot of it was stuff that Keir Starmer could have said, would have said. So raising living standards, ding. Good growth in every postcode. Well, that more or less is a Rachel Reeves refrain. Promising a new political culture, a changed political culture. Well, that feels familiar. Focusing on place before party. Well, that is an Andy Burnham refrain, but country before party is a Keir Starmer refrain that's quite similar. And one of the big policy things that he's talking about, the need to improve the standing of technical and vocational education and bring it up to sort of parity with those who go down the university route. Well, that was at the heart of Keir Starmer's last conference speech. So that's not a big change either. I'm not saying that there isn't a new emphasis with devolution, but a lot of it is slightly less new than you might think. I suppose the skill is just how he sells it all to us.
Yes, another 10-year mission. I think voters might be forgiven for wondering if Labour could hang on to its leaders for 2 years before they start vowing to stay around for a decade. The speech, as you say, Sam, is a bit like the challenge of the Burnham leadership in a nutshell. It's promising that continuity of purpose with a lot of things that were already on the table. So I think there's some common sense there. And you are halfway or towards halfway through a parliament. You're not going to be able to completely remake things that your predecessor had already embarked on. So something like apprenticeships, well, Keir Starmer was really about making this a domestic centerpiece. And I think if the Starmer premiership had continued, we'd have seen a lot more of his personal buy-in on that. I mean, so much so he's messianic about it with his own sort of family and friends and their kids to think about apprenticeships as well as the traditional 3 or 4 year degree. Place before party, well, that's the commitment to localism. Theoretically, the government already does stand for. It has been saying it wants to push more jobs out of London and would support that with Treasury funding. Now, admittedly, it does help that Andy Burnham is associated with it personally in his time successfully associated with the city region of Manchester and thereabouts. To me, the challenge in it is the reindustrialization part, which I did think had a slightly harky-backy sense about that word. He would say it's about upgrading job infrastructure, modernizing it. But it is hard to replicate something like a reindustrialization strategy in poorer parts of the country or where the skills base is lower and where you don't have a big university and modern industrial centre like Manchester on your doorstep. I think he would readily accept that. But we don't at the moment see the plan for it. And also like AI, there's a slightly light mention of that, but everyone, I think, who's looking at the challenges of AI, as one investor said to me over the weekend, look, this Andy Burnham restart will stand or fall depending on a plan to integrate AI into the UK economy and not just build data centres so you're sort of servicing it, but actually what you want to do with it. Reform of utilities, there was another pointer, I think, to something we're all expecting, which is some form of public ownership move, probably starting with the water industry. But, that means the costs then transfer from all the companies that you don't like, or a lot of voters don't like, back to the Treasury, aka back to the government to figure out how to meet the cost of upgrades.
Yeah, it is all quite tricky if he follows through on the ultimate implication of what he's saying. Britain is unbelievably centralised, so it's in that backdrop that the devolution push is taking place. There's a fantastic stat on Bloomberg about just this morning, just about how centralised we are, more than Italy, Norway, France, Spain, Denmark, Germany, US, Switzerland and Canada all put together. If you look at that question by the amount of tax that's raised and kept locally, we're down at just below 5%. Canada's up at almost 50%. The US at just over a third. So we trail. So I wonder whether that's a metric by which to measure it. But then you get different cities with different tax rates, and that could be quite a change as well. When you read the extracts, Anne, I do wonder, whether or not this is also going to have to be accompanied by big change in Whitehall. That's sort of the implication of what we're going to get here, because the change that he's talking about, devolution deals, more powers, take years to sort out. Think of the amount of time it took George Osborne just to negotiate that Greater Manchester deal, and his insistence of there being a mayoralty in return for the powers. It's a multi-year process, but in order to underscore a big bang start to this, might they have to look at something more dramatic? There are some people feeding into Team Burnham that really what he needs to do is split the Treasury, go back to trying to cleave apart the economic ministry function from the spending sort of allocation function in order to sort of do a proper reset at the centre to make it easier to sort of lower the institutional resistance to all of this change. So is it actually going to look massive, or are we too far through a parliament to risk a sort of unwiring number one horse guards parade? Like that's another of the sort of the biggies that we're gonna sort of grapple with today and in the coming weeks.
Absolutely. And I think, as Andrew MacDonald was pointing out in Playbook this morning, we haven't really had a proper stand-up keynote lectern moment, sermon-style speech from the guy setting out what he actually wants to do with the levers of power in his hands, other than exercise it from the centre. So I think you're right to point that out. On the cross-country comparison, because I can't resist those. That's like an extra Weetabix for me. And that, I think, is a really interesting question, because if you say something like, I know you were just citing there a Bloomberg article, but that is a real challenge for Burnhamism. If you say, compare it to something like Canada, well, the Canadian states are absolutely massive, right? They make city regions look minuscule in many cases. If you take something like Ontario, which has done a lot of just in-state health and education reform, that's like doing it nationally or across a large swathe of England, say in the UK. I think, obviously, if you take a comparison with something like Switzerland, which is cantonized, or even some of the German states, you often see some of the problems as well. Like Germany's in the middle of a massive negotiation that goes on regularly between the states and the centre about what it's going to get for its investment. So that's what you're in for, right? And I think that's something that sometimes gets a bit neglected in the drive for localism, is that you do then have to have these mechanisms, or you have what I suspect might be the Burnham model for the next couple of years, because he doesn't have that much time, which is that in the end, you decide at the centre what you think the localities and the region should get. But how far can you go in that, and the time on the table? There is a plan actually for 1.7 billion investment in city regions to give mayors the cash and tools to bulldoze through roadblocks holding up big projects and regeneration schemes, etc., etc. But that was already announced in March by Rachel Reeves. So I guess that Burnham could present himself, Sam, as the PM who does this further and faster, rather than being able to risk much that's essentially new. But in the end, it is about how you tell it. And I suppose it's also about him saying, I stand by this. I will stand by there being some concrete outcome in a couple of years, as opposed to a very long road to a semi-demi-localism.
God, totally. I think you captured the essence of the conundrum over Burnhamism. Is it just repackaging with a few tweaks, or is there something really big and different that's about to happen? And I think hand on heart, nobody really quite knows, which is why this morning is very interesting. The jostle to be in his cabinet goes on. I'm enjoying it, Anne. I really enjoyed Steve Reed yesterday on the Sunday morning round. So his technique is just to say he's a Burnhamite. I mean, months and months of being, wingnut number one for Keir Starmer. And just like that, bang, he's gone. Some, like Emma Reynolds, they just get their team to issue press releases, and bang, like that, they're Burnhamites too. David Lammy has given an interview doing the same. So well done, everybody. The person who's actually sort of gone a bit harder and faster on this is actually Shabana Mahmood, who's been quite an interesting figure in the last few days. She's pressing ahead with policy announcements this morning. She had that ferocious row with the minister and her team. She wanted to sack Mike Tapp, but Number 10 wouldn't let her. He was briefing out proposals which suggested that he sort of borrowed from the Home Secretary. She's actually banned him from having meetings and looking at papers without her permission. So that all feels quite dysfunctional. Thank goodness for it's only for another couple of weeks. Interestingly, Andy Burnham isn't keen on her plan to merge police forces, I discovered on Thursday. So it's another complication for her if she stays in the Home Office job. But there's one name I think that you wanted to talk about, Anne. That's David Miliband. We mentioned him last week. And you've been sort of rifling around. What have you discovered?
Rifling around, exactly. The story of David Miliband returning from New York, the prodigal son of the Labour drama, on and off for years, that tale. But it does appear now that it could happen. Rachel Sylvester reported it in the Observer. Separately, I also have confirmation that there is active consideration of bringing back D-Mill, and that those talks are now serious, according to someone familiar with both ends of them, and close to a final decision. Why is Andy Burnham so keen on bringing back David Miliband? He is interested in his recent foreign policy thinking, and the clue is in a collection of essays on Brexit, edited by Anthony Selden, that's come out on the 10th anniversary. And there's a David Miliband essay contribution in that, which suggests moving closer to the EU. Stop me if you've heard this one before, Sam Kids. But he does push a bit harder, I think, in a way that appeals to Burnham. I think Burnham wants something that, if you like, reshuffles the cards on the way that Britain is talking about getting closer to the EU. And Miliband says this: the British interest, it seems to me, is to put more cards on the table to create political momentum. There are obvious examples if we are willing to look for them. Then you do look through the essay and they're a little bit arcane, but I think we get the drift. Given Miliband's views on Donald Trump, which, although privately held because he's in a major job heading a big humanitarian crisis organization in New York, he doesn't speak on the record and give political opinion, but I think he's known privately to be very outspoken about the Trump era and about the blunders of the Iran war as I think he sees it. That is interesting too, because it would signal, if he does become foreign secretary, a bit of a hardening of tone on that towards the US. And the David Miliband I bump into these days, it is very much in I don't suffer fools gladly mode when it comes to that. So there would be, I think, something of a change in the way that Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper and all have kind of kept a quite, lean back tone on criticising Trump administration. Where would that lead would be an interesting question. So we could end up with two Milibands back around at the same time, which feels like coming around again.
With other figures staying around, there seems to be no dispute that Jonathan Powell may actually hang around as part of this team as well. He had been expected to go at the end of the year, but now it seems as if he will survive, at the very least, the change and transition of Prime Minister. And there seems to be talk about Ollie Robbins returning, obviously ousted by Keir Starmer, and Yvette Cooper. Him coming back, I think, would again make it harder for Yvette Cooper to particularly be able to swallow, since she was one of the driving forces on that sacking. Let's talk just for a moment about Keir Starmer. I was listening to the George Osborne and Ed Balls podcast over the weekend, and they were just talking about how miserable the final days in number 10 and the number 11 are when you know that your time is up. Keir Starmer is obviously continuing to fulfill the role of Prime Minister, but as Osborne and Balls said, power just drains from number 10. Tomorrow, Keir Starmer will finally announce the Defence Investment Plan. They will sell it, I think, as 1.5 billion more than John Healey got, although one person I was talking to suggested that quite a lot of that is little more than an accounting trick. So we'll look at the numbers when we get them tomorrow. And I'm also struck by just how little the paper seem to care about it today. Although I can see the Americans, again via Bloomberg, trying to set up a call with Andy Burnham to find out his views on defence. So again, that sense of power draining away. But there's another little anecdote I got, Anne. I'm told that Keir Starmer actually wanted at one stage to see the three service chiefs that sit beneath the chief of the defence staff, perhaps as early as today, to discuss the Defence Investment Plan. But two of them are on holiday, and one of them is working in America. And while you can summon these people back, it seems like the chief of the defence staff wasn't that keen on the meeting anyway, knowing that they'd only challenged the PM over the final settlement. So that isn't happening. And that just is another just sign that, those levers that Keir Starmer never quite got a handle on are sort of now just vanishing. Poor Keir.
As of last night, someone close to the Defence Investment Plan process telling Playbook the final elements were still being tied down. I think there's still rows that we're going to hear about that arise from this terrible standoff, really, over not being able to deliver the plan under the Starmer premiership, and who is to blame. The straw in the wind there is one of the former chiefs, Sir Tony Radakin. As someone who has, perhaps not been as tested as much as maybe could have been in some of the criticism, is John Healey, because he was so respected as Defence Secretary, but something clearly went wrong in that there was an expectation that the money could be found. And then there was this big row about number 10, number 11, didn't agree with Healey's view. view that it could be, the costings could be made to work. Well, Radican is actually, I think, possibly one census, there might be a memoir coming, pointing the finger at John Healey on that one. So I think there's still quite a lot of bitterness about how it all went wrong. And in fairness to Keir Starmer, something we should just occasionally say on this podcast and elsewhere, it would appear that he felt a bit blindsided by the fact that it had gone so off track. My guess is that that blame shifting is not over yet, but it's going to take place without the Prime Minister. In number 10, the DIP, the investment plan, now gets a bit more money. But, yes, you can add an extra billion or so, $1.5 billion, but that's still nowhere near closing the gap that caused the row in the first place. Big one there landing on Andy Burnham's desk and whoever is his Chancellor, be they called Miliband or something else.
May I just briefly register a quizzical eyebrow of potential criticism towards Tony Radican, the former chief of the Defence Staff, who you just name-checked. You were mentioning the Sunday Times article where he basically says that John Healey wrongly assured the Prime Minister and Chancellor that the 2025 Strategic Defence Review was balanced and affordable. And now he's sort of saying, well, actually, most of the assessments that he saw suggested the budget would needed to rise to about 4% of GDP rather than the 2.5% in the review. Just to point out, he was the chief of defence staff at the time and appears to have failed to raise the alarm. That's actually a point that my colleague Deborah Haynes was making on social media. But if we're talking about blame, the sort of sheer out-of-body quality where former generals appear to be able to display is quite something. Although I suspect with a change of government, we're going to see former prime ministers attempting to do the same thing as well.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I was sort of not particularly holding up a card here for Tony Radican. I was never entirely convinced by his performance as chief, but I do think if your job is to deliver the plan and you feel that the Chancellor, the Prime Minister, the Whitehall system isn't delivering on it, I do think blame is actually shared as opposed to falling on the chiefs. To be continued. We will never stint on handing out blame while ourselves being blameless, except when we go over 20 minutes, which we have now done. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on this Monday. We'll be back tomorrow. We will be delivering the podcast plan on time, on budget tomorrow.
How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.